lost sinners will be turned.
Yes.
Yes. These things in Christ's name. For your honor and glory. Amen.
Amen. Open your Bibles tonight to Daniel chapter 2. We've embarked on a study of the book of Daniel, and we've made our way into chapter 2. I will probably get a little stalled. If my studies unfold like I think they will, I'm going to get a little stalled after this message in chapter 2 for a couple of weeks. But remember where we are. Israel, the northern kingdom called Israel, has been taken over some time ago, over 100 years earlier. The lower kingdom called Judah, which was the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin, they've fallen and become what is called a vassal state. They've fallen to the Babylonians, and they've been allowed to have some pieces of their normalcy intact, but not much. Like the king remained the king, sort of. He's really Nebuchadnezzar's puppet. And there was the exile of many of the choice young men, and that was for reprogramming them. Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are four of them that have been singled out that we know the best. And we know that there were more. But as the king examined these four, he found that their wisdom, because they had their wisdom from God, was 10 times, he described it as 10 times better than all of his own brain trust of wise men and magicians and so on. And so Daniel and his three friends, but Daniel emerges in this dialogue right now as the one that interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel, it told us in verse 17 of chapter 1 that Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. God had blessed Daniel with a special understanding. God had blessed Daniel with the ability to understand dreams. And we will see tonight that it even went farther than that. We saw it last week, that Nebuchadnezzar had the dream, and it startled him. It woke him up. And one of those dreams where you wake up and you're in a puddle of sweat and your heart's pounding, and it troubled him greatly. And he called all the wise men, all the magicians, all the astrologers, all the folks. Now, I don't know why Daniel wasn't in that. I do know that there's several times throughout the book you can see that Daniel is in the crosshairs of the wise men, and they're trying to get rid of him. So I know they didn't like him, and that's not really all that surprising. But Daniel wasn't in the original wise guys. And so they come, they're summoned in haste to come, and Nebuchadnezzar says, I've dreamed a dream, but here's the deal. I forgot what it was. And some say that he didn't forget, but he was testing. It says in chapter 2 in verse 5 and in verse 8 that the thing went from me, or the thing is gone from me, is how it states it. And I think God took it away from him to have Daniel emerge as the one that could answer the questions. But he has this dream. He can't remember it. And so he calls the wise guys to come interpret the dream originally, but then when they get there, he says, it's gone from me. So now he tells them, you got to tell me the dream, and you got to tell me what it means. And they said, nobody asked that. That's crazy. I mean, they're out on a limb with a thin limb and a saw ready to cut it off, and because the king is very angry. And he commands that if they can't tell the dream, that they'll be cut into pieces and their houses be made dunghills. And so in his fury, he ratchets up the heat. Well, Daniel gets wind of this, and he asks for the time from the king. That's the one thing that the wise men asked for, was time. The king wouldn't give it to him. Daniel comes in and says, give me time. I got to pray about this. I'm going to get my 3 friends and we're going to pray about this. Give me time. I'll tell you the dream and what it means. And of course, they made it a matter of prayer. And I love that they made it a matter of prayer, not resting on the fame of his wisdom is, my wisdom is 10 times better than everybody else's. No, God used you, and if we know anything at all, God taught us, and God uses us, and he made it a matter of prayer, and God showed him the dream, as we'll see tonight. And so we pick up in chapter 2 and in verse 20. Chapter 2 and verse 20. Okay, I'm in the wrong chapter. Here we go. I was in chapter 3 and I knew it wasn't in the right spot on the page and it didn't look right. Chapter 2, verse 20. That 19 for context. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel saw Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changeth the times and the seasons. Now that's an interesting thing that Daniel said that. You would immediately think that he's just reminding us that God's in control all the time, summer, winter, spring, fall, night and day. God's in control. He is. But he makes this comment. He changes the times and the seasons, because the interpretation of the dream will involve the changing of kings and the taking down of kings. And he makes that point here, that he changes the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom to the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. So God had revealed to Daniel something only God could know. What another man dreamed. I mean, the other man dreamed it, Nebuchadnezzar, and he couldn't remember it. Now he's in a panic. He woke up out of a dead sleep. He's all the things that you are when you have a really bad dream, and then he can't remember it, but he knows it startled him. He knows it caused him to wake up in a panic. And then he tells them, you got to tell me the dream. And God tells Daniel something only God could know. What Nebuchadnezzar's dream was. And God tells Daniel what the dream means. Verse 23, I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. So he showed us the dream. We'll see not necessarily so much tonight, but the interpretation of it as time unfolds. Verse 24, therefore Daniel went into Arioch. Remember, Arioch was the one in charge of killing the original batch of wise men. Arioch was the one in charge of getting rid of them, because they had displeased the king. So Daniel gets Arioch, from whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Now, right there, that sentence, that's class. Daniel, and it'll unfold more and more in the book, Daniel is not the favorite man of the wise men. They plotted against Daniel repeatedly. You think Daniel didn't know that? I mean, Daniel knew that. Daniel wasn't summoned originally to the king's request. There's a reason for that. Daniel, upon understanding the dream and its interpretation, immediately advocates for the brain trust, the wise men, astrologers and magicians and soothsayers and so on. He could have so easily said, I told you the dream, king, kill everybody else. Daniel so easily could have boasted about that. But he didn't. That's a classy move. A very respectable move. Tells us a lot about Daniel. Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. That, I just love it. Verse 25, and Arioch brought Daniel before the king in haste. Why is this all in haste? Because the king's commandment was urgent, because this is life or death. The edict had gone out. They can't tell me the dream, cut them up into pieces. So Arioch brought Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah. And that's an interesting thing. I found a man. Come on, Arioch. He found you. He came and told you I can figure this out. I found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. So the king referred to him by his Chaldean name. Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation thereof? Can you tell me what I dreamed? I'd like to know. Can you tell me what it means? I'd really like to know that. Daniel answered in the presence of the king. The Bible is quick to point out that Daniel is in the presence of the king. He's not going through some intermediary. He is putting his life on the line in the presence of the king. And said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men and the astrologers and the magicians and the soothsayers show unto the king. Men can't figure this out. And Daniel's going to say in a little bit, neither can I on my own. This wasn't of me. Men can't figure this out. But, verse 28, there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the, look at this, latter days. Thy dream and thy visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. And I want to stop before we get into that. The phrase latter days. I told you earlier in some of the earlier thoughts about Nebuchadnezzar having dreams that God is going to reveal much future by the way of dreams to a pagan individual. Usually the prophet gets the dream and he tells the future and tells what God's going to do. And in this case, Nebuchadnezzar, it's revealed to him. Now it's through Daniel, of course. But Neb had the dream. Maybe an indictment against or a statement concerning the condition of God's people. Might as well use a pagan king to get my message across. And he talks about the latter days. The next verse talks about that Nebuchadnezzar was worried about what should come to pass hereafter. Nebuchadnezzar is a self-absorbed individual. By all accounts, and historians say that he was a genius and that he was a brilliant man. But he was a very self-absorbed king, and he's laying on his bed musing, how long am I going to be king? I wonder how my days on the throne go. I wonder how long they are. Remember, we're not too far from his father passing away. Death may be on his mind. Conquest may be on his mind. He's on his bed wondering about what will happen to me. in my kingdom. And in verse 28, he talks about the latter days. I'm going to make the case, and I'm going to make it for a couple of weeks, that Nebuchadnezzar saw what is referred to in Luke, and we'll read it in a minute, the time of the Gentiles. And I'm going to make the case that the time of the Gentiles is the time of the ruling of the Gentiles in Israel as a nation is not there. And until 1948, and even then, as Israel is a nation, a little postage stamp spot over there in the Middle East, there's a little bit of something that looks like Israel, but that's not the end of the time of the Gentiles. I believe the end of the time of the Gentiles is when the Lord returns in the second coming and sets up and reestablishes His rule with His people on this earth. But from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, which is the last gasp of the kingdom of Judah, and there's a resurgence here or there, and they're able to, Nehemiah is able to go back and build some walls in Jerusalem and restore some things, but they never returned as a nation, a sovereign nation, not like they were under David and Solomon. Nebuchadnezzar stamped out their life, the nation, Israel as a nation. And Israel as a nation, even with the reemergence of Israel as a, quote, nation, 1948, Israel as a nation had not been what she was under David and what she was under Solomon. And she's not going to be until God reestablishes His throne when the Lord comes back in His second return and reestablishes in the latter chapter 19 and 20 of the book of Revelation. That's all the time of the Gentiles. And we're going to make that point. So verse 28, there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. I'm going to talk to you. This dream is going to cover all the way to the latter days. Thy dream and thy visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, this is interesting. He not only tells him his dream, he tells him what he's thinking. Thy thoughts came to thy mind upon thy bed. He told Nebuchadnezzar what he was thinking while he was laying down, musing about the future. One thing that's interesting, that once Daniel starts talking, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't say a word for a long time. I think Nebuchadnezzar is sitting there with his mouth on the floor in awe of what he's hearing. Nebuchadnezzar is just, as for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed. What should come to pass hereafter? How does my kingdom end? How does this all go? What's after me? What's after that? And he revealeth secrets and maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. Now in that you see sovereign God telling a pagan king through Daniel what's going to come to pass. And so that's the context of what we're seeing. As for me, verse 30, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, that thou mightst know the thoughts of thy heart. Now for their sakes, there in verse 30, take your pick. The commentators are split on their sakes for the Jew, because God is encouraging, if you understand what the dream is and what the interpretation is, there's a whole lot of Gentile kings ruling the day for centuries. But it's not permanent. It's God's plan to work with and use the Gentile for a given space of time. And that comes to an end. And if you understand that, As a Jew, you know it's a long time, but there is a revival. There is a resurgence, as we said so many times. There is a resetting and a reestablishing of all that is God upon earth and with His people, Israel, as a central component of that. And so for their sakes, He'll make known. The people of Israel having hope for the future. Like Daniel had hope. He knew there was 70 years of bondage. He read from Jeremiah and understood. We're going to be 70 years of bondage. That's my lifetime, Daniel says. But I know I have hope because at the end of that 70 years, we're coming out of it. Some say this for their sakes is for the brain trust that could have been killed. But now for their sakes, in Daniel's interpretation of it, I lean towards for Israel's sake, that shall make known the interpretation to the king, that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. Thou, O king, sawest. Now he's beginning to tell what he saw, what the dream was. This is the first component, and it's really all we'll get to tonight. It's the first part of the equation. Tell me the dream, and then tell me the interpretation of the dream. He's about to tell him the dream. Now, he's already told him what he was thinking about. I think he's got Nebuchadnezzar's attention quite well. What he was thinking about, in thinking about what shall come to pass hereafter, that was something that was consuming him, and he was thinking about it while he was awake. That's not something he forgot. When Daniel told him that these thoughts were the thoughts in your mind as you mused upon your bed, the king knew he was right. The king knew that Daniel had told him the truth. The king knew that Daniel understood exactly even what he was thinking before he went off to sleep. And so now Daniel's got his attention. He knew what I was thinking. His God can tell him what I dreamed. And thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, and before I get into that, there's a couple of passages I wanted to run to. I'm sorry. I wanted to get some context for explaining this image. And so what I want to do first is just remind you of where we are. And I have. The temple has been looted. Remember that the Lord's temple had been decimated, sacrifice no longer going on in there, and components of it, furniture of it, and utensils of it taken to a pagan temple and used there. Jerusalem besieged, Israel gone as a nation. Neb and several other Gentile kings rule the day for the next several centuries. And look what Hosea is saying. And Hosea is a contemporary. Look what Hosea is saying. I think it has bearing on the dream. Chapter 5. It has bearing for why they're in the condition they are. Hosea chapter 5. I want you to notice verses 3 through 6. Next book past Daniel. Hosea chapter 5, verse 3. I know Ephraim and Israel is not hid from me, for now, O Ephraim, thou committest whoredom, and Israel is defiled. They will not frame their doings to turn unto their God, for the spirit of whoredoms is in the midst of them, and they have not known the Lord. And the pride of Israel doth testify to his face. Therefore shall Israel and Ephraim fall in their iniquity. Judah also shall fall with them. So Israel and Judah are going to fall. Verse 6, they shall go with their flocks and with their herds to seek the Lord. Now if they're going with their flocks and their herds to seek their Lord, they're attempting some sort of sacrifice. But they shall not find him. He hath withdrawn himself from them. So Israel and Judah, the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern, they're gone. For all intents and purposes. As a nation, they're gone. Many passages remind us there's a remnant that remain, but as a nation, they're gone. Chapter 3 of Hosea, verses 4 and 5. Chapter 3 of Hosea, verses 4 and 5. The children of Israel shall abide many days without a king. Now, there's several things to notice about that. The children of Israel abide. They're still there. They're still God's people. He's still got a remnant. He's still going to restore them. But they abide many days without a king. Their national identity is gone. And that because of their rebellion to God. Without a king, without a prince, and without sacrifice, and no temple, no kingdom, everything that you would have expected in the kingdom of David or kingdom of Solomon, none of that's there. And afterward, the children of Israel return. Afterward shall the children of Israel return. So they abide many days without a king, prince, sacrifice. But after that many days, there's a return. Now, this all has great bearing on what Daniel's going to say to the king about the dream. Now, in this context, now let's look at Luke 21 for a minute. Luke 21, verse 24. The Lord speaking says this. And notice this at the very end of verse 23, in the context of what's being stated, in the wrath upon this people. Verse 24 of Luke chapter 21, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. We've seen that. That's what Daniel's living. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. There's a dismantling of the national identity of Israel. And there is, I was going to say a resurgence, but an ussurgence of the national identity of many different pagan kings, many different Gentile kings. And he calls this the times of the Gentiles. When Israel doesn't have a national identity, when Israel is not making sacrifice in their temple and all these different things going on, or not going on as the case may be, and all of this is a part of God's plan. Nothing is out of control. One more passage in the New Testament, Romans, and then we'll go back and wrap up. Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11, verses 25 and 26, just to show you this, the working of God. Romans 11:25, I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, that you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part, has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, there shall come out of Zion a deliverer, and shall turn away the ungodliness from Jacob. So there is a plan. And there is a season. And Daniel said that God changes seasons, Nebuchadnezzar. And there was a season for my people, Israel. And that season's come to an end. And Neb, there's a season for you. And eventually that'll come to an end. And then there's a kingdom after that. But it's going to be a Gentile rule for the foreseeable future. And that's the context. And so that'll help us to understand the dream. And we're only going to get to the dream. We're not going to try to unfold its interpretation tonight. We're already kind of running along a little late. Verse 31 of Daniel 2. So Daniel saw, well, Daniel's telling the king, "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image." And the root of that word is large. This was massive. This was huge. This was big. A great image. This great image whose brightness was excellent. It was shiny. It was polished. It was brilliant. "Thou sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image whose brightness was excellent stood before thee, and the form was terrible." Now we would say in our vernacular, awesome. Terrible in our day carries with it the idea of awful, of horrible, terrible, bad. That's not what it meant. It's not what he means. We would say it was awesome. It was extremely large. It was extremely brilliant and shiny and bright, and that's the beginning of what Daniel begins to tell the king that he saw. Verse 32, "The image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass." Notice the gold is going to be the heaviest metal, and it's on the very top. And as you come down, each metal is a little lighter, as I understand it. Many people make a lot out of that. "The image's head was of fine gold, the breast and arms of silver, belly of his thighs was brass, the legs of iron, and his feet part of iron, part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them in pieces." So you have this image, you have these various components, starting with gold. You get to the bottom that are feet of iron and clay, the cheapest, the weakest metal in the pile. And that's the interesting thing too. A lot of people make a lot to do about the descending value, gold on top, and all of that built on inferior base, inferior foundation. And that's really what I see. There's a lot of weight on top that's not on a right foundation. None of it's got the right foundation. There's a lot of different conjecture about what all that means, but one thing every, I believe, reliable commentator agrees with is that these four basic components, well, the head, and there's no question about the head. Look at verse 38, the latter part. The very last phrase of verse 38. He's talking to Nebuchadnezzar and he said, "Thou art this head of gold." We know that the head of this image that Daniel is reminding Nebuchadnezzar of what he saw, that this head of gold, we know that it's Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. That's the head of gold. That's Nebuchadnezzar and the rule of Nebuchadnezzar. And then what we have under that are the breast and arms. And every reliable commentator makes that the nation, or in this case the dual nation that took down Babylon, and that's the Medo-Persian Empire. And who took them down but the Grecians, Greeks. That's the belly and thighs. And the legs and feet, the Roman Empire. And even in the time of the Lord, now the Roman Empire's intact, and they allowed Jerusalem to do a few. The children of Israel still had Jerusalem. They still had a temple, sort of, but none of it was they weren't truly independent, and they weren't truly ruling their own nation. They were under Roman rule. And all of that is just the stamping out of the nation of Israel as an entity, as a nation. And we will unfold these more as we look through this and its interpretation. But understand this, that in this time of the Gentiles that the Lord talked about in Luke 21:24, that time of the Gentiles no doubt starts with Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. Verse 38, the last sentence. And then the subsequent monarchs and kingdoms and dynasties that follow after him. Even history records that the Medo-Persians took down the Babylonians, and that the Grecians took down the Medo-Persians, and that the Romans took down them, and it's sequential kingdoms rising and falling, the absence of the children of Israel. That's the main point of this. The absence of the children of Israel during the times of the Gentiles. But that time of the Gentiles comes to an end. And I believe the end of it is when the Lord reestablishes His kingdom upon this earth. In Revelation chapter 20 especially. And reestablishes His rule with His people on this earth. The nation of Israel is restored. Remember in our study in Revelation, the temple of the Jewish temple, the Jerusalem temple was rebuilt. John is told to go measure it. Remember that in our study in Revelation. So all of that's being rebuilt. People talk about the rebuilding of the temple now and some of those things. It's not the right rebuilding. The temple rebuilding that I see is in the book of Revelation when John is told to go measure it. It's been rebuilt. It's there. It's about ready for use. And then the Lord's kingdom is reestablished and so on. And the time of the Gentiles is over. But Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream that shows 4 consecutive Gentile dynasties that just one after another obliterate the children of Israel. And they don't even emerge even in a little bit until the 40s. And that is, I don't believe, the end of the rule of the Gentiles, because we don't see the nation of Israel having a prominent role now. They're barely there, but one day they're going to be there. And then we got to get our minds wrapped around this stone that smote the image. We're not going to get into it tonight. But he sees this in verse 35, the iron, clay, the brass, silver, and gold broke into pieces together and became like chaff. Oh, and I missed verse 34. I'm sorry. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut without hands. So this stone that was cut without hands isn't a man-made stone. And what is Jesus? The rock. And He's not man-made. He's not, and He's a stone that the builders rejected. We will develop this, Lord willing, that this stone is none other than the Lord Jesus Christ. And He brake the clay to pieces, the end of verse 34. Break the whole image to pieces. Smote the image, there in verse 34. Then was the iron and the clay and the brass and the silver and the gold broken to pieces together and became like chaff of the summer threshing floor. You know what chaff is. The chaff is the little husky stuff that comes off the grain. You shake it up into the air and have a fan come across it, and the chaff just blows away. This image, gold and silver and all those components, crumbled and crushed to dust and blown away by this stone that was not made by hands. I wonder who that can be. The stone that the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. And notice what about this stone. Verse 35, the wind carried them away, the pieces of the idol, that no place was found for them, and the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This huge image has been pulverized, turned into dust, poof, it's gone. And the stone fills the earth. So we're going to drill down on this in a couple different angles, Lord willing, for a couple different weeks, and see this successive set of Gentile kings rise and fall, and Christ crush them, and His glory fill the earth, and the time of the Gentiles will be over. It started with Nebuchadnezzar because he was the head of gold. But it's going to end with the stone that the builders rejected when he reestablishes and resets everything. And Israel as a nation has a renewed identity on earth. And he rules with a rod of iron. So we have to take some time and digest all that. That'll be a fun study. Lord willing, for a couple of weeks, I think we'll get stalled on that and unfold that a little bit. Interesting, isn't it, how that the Lord uses Daniel. Young man, he's still only about 20. This is right after his reprogramming. And even if he was 17, and that's on the later end of what people estimate, he's 20 now, because this came in right after that 3-year period. And the way God's using this young man, and the grace that He shows, and the class that He shows, and the wisdom that He shows at 20 years old, it's an encouragement. It's a testament to a godly young man. And it's a reminder. He's the same as us. Just wore sandals instead of tennies. He's the same as us, cut out of the same cloth as us. May God give us the grace and the wisdom to conduct ourselves with the wisdom and class that Daniel has, and be used. Remember, with God as his information source, he has unlimited knowledge. And this man of uncompromising character, with God leading him and teaching him, had unlimited knowledge. And he has then immeasurable influence. We'll see him influence Nebuchadnezzar. We'll see him influence Nebuchadnezzar's son. We'll see him influence Cyrus, the king after him, and is a key component of Cyrus allowing the children of Israel to go back and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And Daniel is there for all of it as a key influence. If we want to have good influence on society around us, and the people that we touch and the people that we can affect, Daniel shows us kind of the roadmap. Uncompromising convictions. Just a man of integrity and character. A man of prayer. A man that ends up being greatly used of God. May we strive to be such. Let's stand.